Well, this is Baruch Fleischman back at the Tikkun Elevator Kollel. I am your lift manager, and I hope you're getting some lift out of this. The idea of the Tikkun Elevator Kollel is really the concept, the Kabbalistic concept of the Sefer, which is known as Yesod. Yesod has a unique quality. It is the Yesod is the concept, is really the location also of the sexual apparatus of human beings, men and women. But Yesod has an ability to rise. It's like an elevator. That's what we call the Tikkun Elevator Kollel, because what we're doing over here is we're trying to really reach the higher level, reach the level that's beyond this world, to be able to connect to eternity. There are different paths to it. One of the paths is through Jewish astrology, and that brings us over to the great, I think, YAAKOV KRONENBERG. So the Gaon of Vilna, here's where we're talking about, continuing on to what we were talking about last time, wants to connect these 12 letters. In the last year, he discussed how there are 3 combinations of the letters Yud, K, and Vav, the first 3 letters, plus a 4th letter, which is their receptacle, which makes 12 in all. Those letters is what we're talking about, is the number 12 seems to be really important to the whole concept here. So he's connected these 12 letters to the 3 times in which the Havaya of God's name is mentioned in that verse, which talks about God's kingship, which is Hashem Melech again. Hashem rules. Hashem Malach. Hashem did rule. Hashem Yimloch L'olam Voed, and will always rule forever and ever. So that's it. If you take the actual word of Hashem, which is 4 letters, that is 3 letters, which he said Yud K Vav, and then he says there's a Hey attached to them. It makes 3 times 4, which is 12, which is 3 times the 4-letter name of God. So altogether it makes 12 letters. But let us go on now. Let's go on to the next part. And these 12 senses of the body, or the soul, which are speech, going back to this again, which he mentioned before, and I have very little background for this. So this is so exciting for me in the sense that it's filling in blanks. So what is this? He says there are 12 senses of the body, not 5 senses. He didn't say there's a 6th sense. He says there's 12. So what are they? What are the 12? So the 12 senses of the body are the soul, which are speech, thinking, motion, seeing, hearing, action, intercourse, smell, sleep, anger, eating, and last one is laughter. They have no opposites. They are not like the Bagad Kafrat. They're not like the letters that could be pronounced more than one way. They don't have themselves together with anything which we see as their opposite. They don't have opposites. They're singular by themselves, such as love and hate, for example, are war and peace, or up and down, life and death, and things like that. So they're not like the 7 double letters. They are similar to the 12 simple letters. They're like 12 simple letters. And indeed, the last chapter, we discussed the 7 double letters, and soon we shall learn the 4th chapter too, which what we got from there, which discusses the 7 double letters and how they are connected to the planets. So we really have to start understanding what the difference between the planets and the constellations is. Now, every constellation has planets in it. That's what I'm thinking. And this is something which most of the astrologers don't really talk about. The fundamental difference between the planets and the constellations, again, which we are going to talk about later. In other words, this chapter is connected to the constellations, while the 7 double letters connected to the planets. So let's just do our numbers. There are 12 constellations. And in those constellations, there are, some of them have different combinations of planets that are in those constellations. So he says there are 7 planets, which are the 7 planets are the Sun, the Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Let's say the Sun, the Moon, I'm counting that out, that's 2. Next one is Mercury, that's 3. Mars and Venus is 5. And then Jupiter and Saturn, that's the 7. They're called the Kokve Leches. They're called the stars, or their planets, that are orbiting. So these are the orbiting planets, which are orbiting around the sun and the sun itself. Excuse me. Well, the $7 now this so therefore you have the 12 constellations, which are Aries all the way down around the horn to Pisces. There are 12, and in each one of them there are possibilities of the 7 planets being in them. But in any case, those 7 double letters, which he says now are correspond to the 7 planets, which we talked about in the last chapter, each has something opposite to it. For example, there's wealth and poverty, life and death, etc. But as we mentioned before, these 12 senses, which are discussed in this chapter, do not have anything which is opposite. They stand alone. Let me move this up a little bit. We can see it better. And even though you can say, for example, that sight indeed is an opposite, which is blindness, and that the opposite of hearing is being deaf, as the Gaon of Vilna continues explaining in this text of his, this is not really an opposite, but the lacking of the sense. It's not an opposite because it's not a force. It means that it's just not there. So blindness is the lack of sight and not the opposite of sight, and being deaf is the lack, not the opposite of hearing. In other words, a blind person or a deaf person is missing the organs from which the sight and hearing go out, from the potential to the actual. In other words, the blind person is missing what actualizes the sense of seeing, and the deaf person is missing what actualizes the sense of hearing, but they still somehow have the senses of seeing and hearing in them, though these senses don't reach their potential, or they don't work, or they work badly. And furthermore, the opposite is not thought of as an opposite unless it is a subject by itself. Try and explain this. Get this up a little bit more so we can get it up to the top. And furthermore, the opposite is not thought of as an opposite because it is a subject by itself, and this is just as we have war and peace, where war and peace are two things which are opposite to one another. War is one thing and peace is something else. So things like poverty, death, and war are things upon themselves, and they are indeed the opposites of wealth, life, and peace, which are things upon themselves too. In other words, their own entity. War is not peace, death is not life, poverty is not wealth, but they are all things upon themselves, even though they are opposites and lacking of each other. And these things also have the quality of having a little bit or a lot of each. So let's look at it again. These things have the quality of having a little bit or a lot of each. Like, say, for example, a little bit of war or a little bit of wealth. That's not the case with the 12 senses. As for the 12 senses, all they have is existence or absence. Either it's there, the 12 senses themselves are either there or they're not. If it either exists or it's missing, which means that they are in a situation in which they are either established or they are not established. In other words, they have no opposite. They exist or they don't. If they are not established, they are not thought of. In other words, the non-existence of one thing among these 12 senses is not necessarily its opposite. So, for example, blindness is not the opposite of seeing in the sense that it is not an exchange of seeing. It is just the absence of seeing. That said that. But war, on the other hand, is the opposite of peace. But being deaf, for example, is just the absence of the sense of hearing, but not the opposite of it. And this is what the Gaon of Vilna wants to explain. And he says, which is the fundamental difference between the doubles, which are the planets and the simple letters and constellations of the zodiac. So he says, let's go on. Now, let me just stop and think this again. He says the constellations, which are the planetary groups. So say, for example, he said Leo. Let's just say Leo. Or right this time of year, we're really starting into Sagittarius. So Sagittarius is a conglomeration of different planets and planets within itself, and it's what the planets are in there is really important because the planets have different qualities, whereas the constellations, this is what I'm getting at, it is fixed. It's fixed the way that it is. Sagittarius is Sagittarius, and that's what it's always going to be. On the other hand, if you have Mars in Sagittarius, well, it could be this way or it could be that way, depending on the planetary influences that are there. Let's go on. And out of these 12 senses that exist in every speaking person, 10 exist even in animals. And 2 of them, which are thinking and laughter, exist only in human beings. And there is a similarity in that in the 12 constellations, let's say, for example, 10 of them exist in animals too, while the other 2, which are Gemini and Virgo, exist only in human beings. Now, that's very interesting. Gemini and Virgo, I know from reading him in other places, are ruled by the ruling planet is Mercury. So these things, he's saying the mercurial, which is the thought aspect, according as I understand in astrology, doesn't exist in animals. Exists only in human beings. In other words, what the Gaon of Vilna says here is that if you looked at the pictures of the constellations in the sky, you see Gemini, for example. Let's say Gemini, for which means twins. And this is a constellation which has the shape of 2 boys in the sky. So apparently how they would draw this, or the way that the ancients understood this Masorah, was that that's what the constellation looks like. So let's take Virgo, which is the constellation of the shape of which is similar to that of a virgin, of a young girl, which is a young maiden. And these are pictures, are shapes of human beings. But the other 10 constellations are of shapes of animals and intimate objects, but not the shapes of people. So that's an important idea. The first one he says is that the way the constellation is structured, if you put lines between them, you can connect them. And in the case of Mercury, they would look like two boys. In the case of Virgo, you could make it look like a person, also like a female person, like a young maiden. Now he says, and these pictures are shapes of human beings, but the other 10 constellations, which would be, for example, Aries. Aries is really in the shape of a ram, or Taurus in the shape of a bull, or Leo in the shape of a lion. So let's go on. And the Gaon of Vilna further explains that the constellations of Gemini and Virgo are connected to Mercury, and Mercury is the planet of speech. It controls the sense of speech, and speech is what differs the human being from everything else. The special thing about human beings is that they have the ability to speak, and due to that, Mercury and these 2 constellations had been given a human sign. So in other words, the one looks like a pair of boys, and the other looks like a young girl, because they represent speech, which is the highest attribute of a human being, and this is what separates the human being from animals, because animals are not able to speak. And now the Gaon of Vilna, the Gaon is also going to explain the difference between the 3 letters of Aleph, Mem, and Shin, which he had said previously represent the mother. And then he says, and then let's talk about the 7 double letters and the 12 simple letters. We'll put them all together. Now, what do we have here? We have 7 and 3, the first 3. Then we have 7, and then we have 12. That makes 22. Now, the letters of Aleph, Mem, and Shin, what about them? They represent the essence of a thing, which is called in Hebrew the Etzem Adavar, or it would be like the neshama of it. And they are the foundations of the world which are mentioned in Sefer Yetzira, which what are the 3 foundations of the world? He says there are 3. Now, the air, water, and fire. Now, I'm just thinking myself that he made a big point about taking the name Hashem Melech, Hashem, this phrase, Hashem Melech, Hashem Malach, Hashem Yimlok Be'ed, and he divided each time that the name Hashem was mentioned into 3, and then plus 1. So he said that the elements that we're really talking about here, the Etzem Adavar, are air, water, and fire. But to collect them, you need earth. Earth represents Malchus. In other words, the idea in Jewish philosophy is that anything you take away from something so that thing loses its meaning by the thing which had been taken away is considered an etzem. Now let's try to retranslate that. You're looking at at the 4 letters of Hashem's name. Maybe he's going to say this. I'm just thinking it for myself. We'll see what he says. The first 3 letters are Yud, K, and Vav. Those 3 letters, if you remove them, you would be left with the K. That's all. Because that would be the final K. So the etzem is kind of like the idea of the light, the etzem of the light, the essence of the light, which was going to flow into the final K. Let's see what he says again. In other words, the idea in Jewish philosophy is that anything you take away from something so that the thing loses its meaning by the things which have been taken away is considered an etzem. For example, if you take away the tip of a pen, which you write with, and by doing that you actually break the pen, then it's not a pen anymore. It's just a stick now. It loses its essence because you broke its tip away from it. And without the writing tip, the pen's not any good, not a pen. But on the other hand, if you peeled off the color of the pen or scratched it, say for example, it's still a pen, but you have just changed it incidentally. So this is the idea of the letters of Aleph, Mem, and Shin. What does that mean? What is the idea of the Aleph? They are the essence. They are the essential letters and represents the essential things which are fire. One of them represents fire, one represents air, and one of them represents water. And in the soul they represent the head, the body, and the limbs. Now that's a lot there. It's a lot, he said a lot to keep track of this. So let's go back. He has the concept like this. If you have 4 letters and you take 3 of them away and you have finally just the last hey, now this is my metaphor, what I'm working on, then the hey doesn't mean anything by itself because it needs the flow from up above, which is the essence of it, to come into it. So here we say, on the other hand, if you peeled off the color of the pen, so you instead of being a gold pen, it's now going to be just, I don't know, scratched silver. It's still a pen. But you have just changed it incidentally. It's just a superficial change. So this is the idea of the letters Aleph, Mem, and Shin. They're the essential letters and represent the essential things. They are the pen according to this metaphor. They're the pen itself, which are fire. And he says, give me an example. Well, an example would be fire, air, and water. If there's fire, fire is fire. It's always fire. Even if it's a little fire, a big fire, whatever it is, it's fire. Air, it's always out there, it's all they're breathing, and water, the same thing, an essential part of everything, and in the soul. So he says, now I'm just taking the order, I don't know the order. I'm just taking the order that he has. The first one is fire. He said that would represent the head, air would be the body, and water would be the limbs. Now, is that right? But I don't know, we'll see, just speculating. But the 12 senses are not essential, but they are attached to their essential. For example, the sense of seeing and hearing is attached to the head. And without the essential, there was no head, then don't talk about the hearing and seeing. And without it, the essentials, it's impossible the senses to exist. For example, without the head, it would be impossible the senses of seeing and hearing to exist. So the senses are attached to the elements. So, and the 7 double letters, let's go back. These are the letters which could be pronounced 2 different ways, which represent wisdom, wealth, war, and war. Let me go again. There's 7 of them. Wisdom, wealth, war, and things like that. They're really incidentals because they're not essentials. Not sure what he means yet. So let's say you're a person and you're wise or dumb, wealthy or poor. It doesn't matter. It doesn't change the fact that you're a person. Oh, interesting. So you're always a person, whether you're wealthy, healthy, at war, or at peace. And these letters, as well as what they represent, do not cling to the essence itself and can exist without it. So the Gaon of Vilna says that there are 3 different stages. There's the stage of the 3 letters Aleph, Mem, and Shin, which he says are essential. And it's really fantastic. He's really defining this for me and for you, which are the elements. These are the elemental letters. These are the root letters. These are the letters which never change, and without them, there's no reality. And they are the etzem, the essence of the thing itself. And if you take any one of them away, let's say you take one away. So he says the things they are the things they are essence of don't exist. So in other words, without the head, there's no ears. And then you have the 12 simple letters, which represents the senses. And they are attached to the essences. So understand that the concept of seeing has to have an essence, which is the head. They are attached to the fundamental elements of fire, air, and water. So it is possible to exist without those senses, but not without the essences themselves. And on top of that, there are double letters, which represents things that are not attached to the elements. They are not attached to the essences. They talk about and represent things like wisdom, wealth, and things like that, which are incidentals. In other words, in Hebrew, it's called tophel. It's called subservient to. In other words, you could be with these things or without them, and they are not going to change the question of whether you exist or not. They're not going to change your existence. So the Gaon of Vilna gave us another another explanation about the difference between these three, 7, and 12 letters in the Hebrew alphabet. So I'm going to stop right here. I think we went a little bit long today. This is Baruch Fleischman. You've been rising up here at the Tikkun Elevator Kollel.